everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is Tony Robbins. Listen, if you've been listening along during the holiday season, you know that each week we've been featuring one of the 10 true gifts of life, the gift of emotion, the gift of drive, the gift of growth and how it transforms our life, the gift of joy, of gratitude, of love and connection, of consciousness, of grace, of presence, and of course, forgiveness. And this session we've created, it was really special. What's made it very special, first of all, is the guest that we're going to have. The guest is a person who's a scholar, an extraordinary author, and a dear friend of our family. In fact, many of you know our passionate support for Byron Katie, a woman who created this method for questioning our negative thoughts, our destructive thoughts, so that we can free ourselves from them. And she's just a genius. She wrote a book called The Work. In fact, people that go to Business Mastery, I teach a shortened version of that, for even to be used in business. It's an extraordinary tool. But even if you're familiar with Byron Katie and The Work, you may not be familiar with the fact that her husband, Stephen Mitchell, is a total genius. An author, he's published, I believe, almost a dozen books now. Books on the Tao Te Ching, the Book of Job, Bhagavad Gita, Beowulf, the Odyssey, and the Gospel According to Jesus. And his books are reimaginations of these biblical stories or these stories from the great religious books from around the world. As a scholar, he brings them to life. And recently, Sage and I were sent one of his books, and we decided during Thanksgiving that we would read it together aloud as a family. It was Sage and I and our dear close friend Mary B. and another dear friend, James Bowman, kind of our chosen family. And it was so beautiful. We were so moved. We said, let's bring Stephen on and let's get people exposed to this book, because the story is really about Joseph, the biblical story, Joseph and his 11 brothers from Genesis. Tolstoy called it the most beautiful story of all time. It's a story of true forgiveness, which is not about forgiving those who've wronged us like we're so much better than they are. It's finding the higher or the deeper meaning in all that we've been through. If you're familiar with the story, you know that Joseph starts out as a very egotistical brat, and his brothers turn on him and plot his demise. And you can look at how evil and how horrible they are, but as he goes through these horrible experiences of massive injustice and unfairness, in the midst of it all, instead of blaming, which is what human beings tend to do, right? We try to blame something outside ourselves. He has this awakening, and he begins to see that there's a higher purpose in it all, that even the pain he's been put through, even the injustice, instead of blaming those that did this, he begins to see his brothers and all those that have tried to harm him as being actually sent by God. They're characters in a play to help him develop spiritually, to spiritually mature from the place of victimhood and blame to transformation and finding how to use whatever life brings us to create a higher good for ourselves and those we love. At one point in the story, if you're familiar with it, Joseph literally becomes transformed from being enslaved and unjustifiably tortured and abused and attacked to becoming the right hand of the Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world at that stage. And there's a point in which he has the opportunity to take his vengeance against his brothers and all that have harmed him. And because he's grown spiritually, his forgiveness is not to them. His forgiveness is to himself for thinking that they were trying to harm him instead of understanding there was a higher purpose. It is a just gorgeous story. I read it in the Bible, of course, and I found the story to be interesting, but Stephen has this ability to step into the characters, to reimagine what's being implied in the story and give you a level of detail that just brings it to life like no other. And so we're very excited for you to be exposed to this book. It's had a deep, touching effect on our family. It puts injustice in a higher meaning place. And if you've been in a situation yourself, perhaps where you feel like you've been through tough times recently, or maybe a long time ago, things that are still affecting you, and I really encourage you to listen to this podcast from a different perspective. We all learn best through stories. Throughout human history, that's how we've passed on different values, a different set of meanings. This is literally the story of a man's spiritual growth. It's going from an immature man who's all about himself to a place of such freedom from pain and frustration and anger and resentment. It's sadness, victimhood, it's all gone. All the suffering is gone because he finds a higher meaning, and that's the only thing that transforms us. I'm sure you've had moments in your life where something happened that was so unfair, so unjust, so terrible, and at the time you hated it, or even now, you'd never want to go through it again. Well, you look back on it 5 or 10 years later and you say to yourself, my God, I can see the higher purpose. Because that happened, I have so much more compassion, or I became so much stronger, or I care so much more. Maybe this podcast can open that up for you so that this holiday season, or any time as you enter this new year and this new decade, you can really find something deeper that frees you from pain. That's my heartfelt prayer and wish for you. Because, happiness doesn't just come to us. Our 2 million-year-old brain is designed to look for what's wrong. It's a survival brain. It's its job. Happiness is your job. And to find happiness, you got to find meaning. And I think this phenomenal story, one of the great stories of all time, can open that up for you, especially through the eyes and ears and heart and soul and the writing of this beautiful man.
We'll begin with a few passages from the book, read by Stephen, starting with a chapter called Humility, in which Joseph is thrown into a pit and left to die by his brothers. These are his thoughts as he lay in the empty cistern.
The way up and the way down are one and the same, wrote an ancient philosopher. The stone cistern where Joseph lay was the womb of his transformation. He had to descend to the depths of himself and stay there in that inner darkness, without refuge, without hope. This was the only path that could lead him upward. Then he had to find his way through a world of paradox, where exile is homecoming, slavery is freedom, and not knowing is the ultimate wisdom. No one, of course, wants to suffer, and yet the fortunate among us manage to learn from our suffering what can be learned nowhere else. We become clearly, joyously aware of the cause of all suffering. Instead of sleep, the remembered pain drips into the heart, and an understanding dawns on us, even against our will, that there is a violent grace that shapes our ends. Humility follows as a natural result. We learn how to lose control. We discover that we never had it in the first place. Humility looks very ordinary. It's hello and goodbye. At first, it may seem like dying. What you were so proud of when you were flying high, you now recognize as selfish. It falls apart under scrutiny, and there is a profound change that takes place within you. There is no humiliation or shame in any of this. It's total surrender to what is. You discover that you have let go into an intelligence that is incomparably vaster than yours. And it's the gentlest